She was humiliated in front of a plane full of strangers, mocked for the color of her skin, treated like an intruder in a place she had every right to be. But what no one on that flight knew was that the woman they tried to break held a power that would soon bring their world crashing down. On that day, a black woman named Alicia Monroe boarded Flight 718 with nothing more than her intelligence, her quiet strength, and a notebook filled with ideas the world would one day chase after. But before she could even take her seat, the forces of prejudice moved against her, small at first, like whispers behind polished smiles, then bolder, sharper, until her dignity was dragged out into the aisles for all to trample. Flight attendants exchanged smirks, passengers muttered under their breath, assumptions hardened into judgment with no questions asked, because in their eyes, no matter what she wore or how she carried herself, her skin spoke louder than her mind ever could. They laughed when she protested, they mocked when she stood tall, and they cheered when threats were made to remove her, believing they had put her back in her place. But they did not realize the place they tried to banish her to was not below them. It was far above. This is not just a story about injustice. It is about what happens when the people society underestimates decide they have had enough. Before this plane would even land, lives would be ruined, fortunes would collapse, and the very foundation of their arrogance would be shattered. Stay tuned, because you will not believe how far a single act of cruelty can fall when the truth is finally unleashed. Make sure to like this video if you believe every person deserves respect. Subscribe for more powerful stories like this one, and comment below where you are watching from and which moment hit you the hardest. Dr. Alicia Monroe moved through the jet bridge toward Flight 718, her steps quiet but assured, her black leather notebook pressed tightly against her chest. Around her, the polished surfaces of the first-class boarding area gleamed under the midday lights, the air humming with quiet conversations and the soft clink of expensive luggage wheels. Alicia was dressed simply yet elegantly in a navy blue sheath dress and modest pearl earrings, her natural curls pinned back neatly, her every movement composed. She belonged, at least by every visible standard, yet the glances thrown in her direction suggested otherwise. The crew waiting near the cabin door took notice of her immediately. Greg Sanders, a senior flight attendant known for his offhand arrogance, narrowed his eyes slightly as Alicia approached. His colleague Veronica, standing at his side, shifted her weight and muttered something under her breath, her smile thinning. Without hesitation, Greg slid his phone from his pocket, pretending to check a message, and snapped a discreet photo of the black woman clutching the worn notebook. He angled the screen toward Veronica with a smirk that needed no words. It was a private joke, a shared understanding rooted in assumptions neither bothered to question. As Alicia handed over her boarding pass, Greg's fingers brushed it with unnecessary slowness, his eyes darting to the page before offering a practiced, hollow welcome. Alicia thanked him softly and moved forward into the first-class cabin, unaware of the exchange unfolding behind her. She selected her seat, 1A, a spacious leather recliner beside the window. The seat was pristine, tucked against a gleaming panel of polished wood and chrome. Alicia settled in, placed her notebook on the tray table, and withdrew a slim pen from her bag. Her mind already raced ahead to the symposium she would attend in Geneva, where her research on renewable energy storage would be revealed for the first time. Meanwhile, at the galley, Greg and Veronica hunched over Greg's phone. The image of Alicia's notebook filled the screen, the black cover worn, the pages dense with equations and circuit diagrams. Greg chuckled under his breath and typed a quick caption into the crew group chat. "Look what our genius brought to playtime." Veronica snickered, tapping back a laughing emoji and shaking her head. They believed they had spotted an imposter, a fraud dressed in professional armor, someone who did not deserve the privilege she claimed. Around them, the first-class cabin buzzed with the usual chatter of corporate travelers, entrepreneurs, and retirees sipping champagne. No one paid much attention to the young black woman in seat 1A, but the few glances that drifted her way carried an unmistakable edge of skepticism. Alicia, oblivious to the poisonous murmurs just a few feet away, flipped open her notebook and began writing rapidly. Her pen moved with effortless precision, translating complex theoretical models into tidy rows of numbers and symbols. To her, the cabin noise receded. To her, there was only the hum of inspiration, the adrenaline of ideas blooming into shape. To Greg and Veronica, however, every line she drew, every figure she sketched, was further confirmation of their prejudices. Greg leaned closer to Veronica and whispered sarcastically, "Wonder if she's designing a paper airplane to fly us out of here." The moment passed quickly, but the atmosphere around Alicia continued to curdle. Even small gestures, passengers leaning subtly away, flight attendants offering extra smiles to other guests while barely acknowledging her presence, etched the outline of something darker. Still, Alicia pressed on, undeterred. Her father's voice rang faintly in her memory, stern and steady. "You will be twice as good and still be questioned. Do it anyway." She had taken that lesson and built a career on it, a reputation that had earned her invitations to the most prestigious scientific conferences in the world. And yet, at 30,000 feet, armed with nothing but her brilliance and her notebook, she remained a target for casual cruelty masked as professionalism. Veronica adjusted her fitted jacket and smoothed her perfectly coiffed hair, her mind already spinning with the narrative she would soon enforce. She decided that it was time to take action, to reassert the control she believed was slipping from her fingers. Approaching Alicia with a professional smile plastered on her face, Veronica leaned slightly forward and said with a tone just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass again, please, for verification?" Alicia looked up, her brown eyes steady and calm, catching the slight tremor of disdain behind the polished veneer of the request. Without hesitation, she retrieved her ticket from the inside pocket of her jacket and handed it over, her movements fluid and confident. Veronica accepted the ticket, her manicured fingers lingering a second too long, pretending to scrutinize the information even though she knew full well it was valid. She tapped the screen of her handheld device and frowned slightly for effect, a small furrow appearing between her sculpted eyebrows. Greg watched from a distance, arms crossed, his mouth twitching in amusement, while a few curious glances from other first-class passengers floated toward Alicia, sensing tension without context, but ready to judge all the same. Veronica straightened up and said, "It seems there may be an error in the system. Would you mind following me to the front desk for a moment while we resolve this issue?" Alicia's fingers tightened slightly around the notebook resting on her lap, but her voice remained composed as she replied, "There is no error. This is my seat." Veronica smiled tighter, the corners of her mouth pulling downward despite her best efforts to seem cordial. "Just a routine verification, ma'am," she insisted. Behind her, Greg stifled a chuckle. Reluctantly, but without outward resistance, Alicia stood, her every movement measured, her notebook tucked securely under her arm like a shield. The cabin seemed to pulse with subtle shifts as conversations hushed and eyes darted between screens and books, yet flickered back toward the unfolding scene with barely concealed interest. No other passenger had been subjected to such scrutiny. No one else paraded like a potential fraud in a cabin built on the illusion of merit. Veronica led Alicia toward the front, her heels clicking sharply against the polished aisle, a sound that felt accusatory with each step. Near the galley, Veronica turned slightly, lowering her voice and adding a cutting remark meant only for Alicia's ears. "It's important we maintain the brand image for our premium passengers." Alicia paused for a fraction of a second, her spine straightening even further, but she said nothing. The implication was clear enough. You do not belong. At the small reception desk, another crew member named Aaron cast an uncertain look at Veronica, who gave him a curt nod. Alicia handed her boarding pass over again, and Aaron scanned it into the system. A beep confirmed its authenticity, but Veronica waved it off with a dismissive hand motion, saying, "There must be a back-end mismatch. We'll find a solution shortly." She turned to Alicia and continued, "For now, we would like to offer you a seat in our economy section. Complimentary, of course." Alicia's jaw tensed imperceptibly, and she replied firmly, "I paid for this seat weeks ago. I am not moving." Her voice was calm but immovable, like iron under velvet. Veronica pressed on, adopting a falsely sweet tone. "We would appreciate your cooperation. First class can be a little exclusive, and we must ensure everyone feels comfortable." The layers of prejudice dripped from her words like slow poison. Alicia's eyes narrowed slightly, her expression unreadable. Passengers in nearby rows had begun to murmur among themselves, some nodding as if Veronica's actions were justified, others casting guilty glances before pretending to return to their reading. Alicia knew this pattern. She had lived it too many times before. Respect demanded proof, while disrespect required only an instant assumption. Greg approached from behind, arms folded, reinforcing Veronica's silent threat. Alicia considered her options swiftly, her mind calculating risk and outcome with the precision of a strategist. Causing a direct confrontation now would only validate the silent judgment circling the cabin. Staying silent, however, would let injustice fester unchallenged. "I am not moving," Alicia repeated, her voice low but carrying undeniable authority. Veronica's smile faltered for the briefest second before she recovered, her eyes narrowing with barely masked contempt. "Then please wait here while we escalate this to a manager," she said stiffly. Alicia stood silently beside the desk, notebook still clutched against her side, surrounded by the invisible fortress she had built over years of surviving spaces never meant for her. As Veronica disappeared behind the galley curtain, Greg remained stationed near Alicia like a sentinel, his posture radiating smugness. Passengers craned their necks for a better view, phones flickering in hands that pretended to scroll news feeds but were angled just enough to capture glimpses of the scene. She did not move, did not flinch, even as she felt the scrutiny gnawing at her composure. Behind the scenes, Veronica Hart was speaking in hushed tones with another senior attendant, a man named Travis, their heads bent together in a tight, conspiratorial knot. Alicia could hear snatches of their conversation, whispers of procedures, regulations, and protecting the integrity of first class, as if her very presence had somehow violated a sacred space. She adjusted her grip on her notebook and prepared to wait as long as necessary. Without warning, a junior attendant with a flushed, nervous face approached, dragging Alicia's sleek black carry-on behind him. His voice stiff and mechanical as he said, "Ma'am, we will be moving your luggage to the cargo hold for the remainder of the flight. Standard procedure for reassigned seating." Alicia's stomach tightened, her muscles locking in place, but outwardly she remained composed. She had heard no announcement about luggage policies changing. No one else around her was having their bags confiscated. The move was deliberate, humiliating, calculated to strip her of autonomy in front of a silently judging audience. She met the young man's eyes squarely and said in a voice that carried only to them, "My seat has not been reassigned. My luggage stays." The young attendant hesitated, glancing toward Veronica, who stood several feet away, her arms crossed, watching the exchange with a slight smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but it's already been authorized," the attendant said, his tone softening into apology, though his actions remained mechanical. Alicia knew resisting physically would play into every ugly narrative already forming around her, so she released her grip on the handle with a precision that spoke volumes without a single word. As the attendant wheeled her bag away, the low murmur of conversation among the first-class passengers surged again. From a third row, Preston Moore, a rotund man in an expensive gray blazer with thinning blonde hair and a perpetual smirk plastered across his face, leaned over toward the man seated next to him and let out a loud, derisive chuckle. "Guess you can take the girl out of Coach," he said in a stage whisper, "but you can't take Coach out of the girl." His laughter spilled into the surrounding rows, drawing a few chuckles, a few uncomfortable glances, and many more studious silences from those who would rather not get involved. Alicia heard it all. The words hung in the air, rancid and heavy, but she did not grant them acknowledgement. She did not turn her head, did not meet Preston's smug gaze, did not give him the satisfaction of knowing he had struck a nerve. Instead, she stood as if rooted to the polished floor, a monument of dignity in a storm of casual cruelty. Greg Sanders, watching from a few feet away, barely contained his grin, exchanging a knowing look with Veronica. Veronica, sensing the moment was tipping definitively in their favor, approached Alicia again, her tone syrupy sweet. "We will have a seat ready for you in economy within moments," she said, her words heavy with patronizing finality. Alicia merely nodded once, slowly, the movement more of a refusal to bend than a signal of agreement. The first-class cabin resumed its superficial tranquility, but the tension still simmered just beneath the surface. Alicia remained where she was, her eyes unfocused yet piercing, her mind replaying each slight, each indignity, each wordless judgment, layering them into a quiet fury that she folded neatly into the pages of her memory, like one folds a letter before sealing it with wax. She was no stranger to this battlefield, but today's affront carried a different flavor, a sharpened edge, because today was not just another day she would survive. Today was a day she would remember. Across the aisle, Preston Moore watched her with amusement, nudging his companion and muttering under his breath. Bet she thought a fancy dress and a notebook would buy her a ticket to the big leagues. His words oozed contempt, and though some passengers laughed politely, others glanced down at their laps or out the window, unwilling to meet Alicia's gaze or challenge the injustice unfolding before them. Silence became complicity, as it so often does. The minutes dragged on, each second weighted with the knowledge that Alicia was being punished not for any failure on her part, but simply for existing in a space where others had decided she did not belong. Yet Alicia stood firm, her breath steady, her body still, her very presence an act of rebellion against the tides of exclusion crashing around her. Forced to wait in the cramped space near the service desk, stripped of her carry-on and publicly degraded, she returned to her notebook in an act of quiet defiance, unfolding it carefully, as if reclaiming a piece of her dignity that had been rudely stolen. Her pen moved steadily across the page, translating complex energy storage algorithms into refined equations, her handwriting as precise and elegant as the circuits she diagrammed. Despite the storm swirling around her, Alicia remained in control of herself, allowing the math to ground her in a reality no one in this cabin could touch. From the front galley, Veronica Hart noticed Alicia writing again, her lip curling at the sight of the woman still asserting her presence in the sacred domain of first class. Without hesitation, driven by a petty cruelty she no longer bothered to hide, Veronica marched forward, her polished heels striking the floor with sharp, angry beats. She stopped beside Alicia and, without asking permission or offering explanation, reached down and snatched the black notebook from her hands in a swift, dismissive motion. Alicia's fingers instinctively tightened, but Veronica's grip was firm, triumphant. Holding the notebook aloft like a confiscated toy, Veronica flipped through the pages with theatrical exaggeration, her voice rising so that everyone nearby could hear her disdain. "What is this, doodles? Scribbles? Did you get bored playing scientist?" she sneered, her laughter slicing through the growing hush of the cabin. Alicia sat still, refusing to react, though inside her blood burned with fury held in careful check. The passengers who had earlier avoided looking at her now turned openly, curiosity and derision lighting their faces. Preston Moore let out a loud bark of laughter from his seat in the third row, thumping the armrest with the palm of his hand as he gasped, "Would you look at that? A regular Einstein in the making." His companion chuckled along with him, the sound vulgar and satisfied. From 2 rows back, a younger passenger, a woman in her 20s with a phone already in her hand, lifted it slyly, pretending to check messages, but angling the camera lens toward the scene unfolding just a few feet away. Her phone caught Veronica flipping through Alicia's notebook with feigned confusion, holding up a page filled with dense formulas and circuits and laughing as she said, "Maybe she thinks she's solving world hunger up here in first class." A ripple of laughter moved through the cabin, some passengers laughing loudly, others offering polite, nervous smiles to blend into the moment and avoid drawing attention. The young woman recording smiled to herself, already composing the caption she would use when uploading the clip later. First class genius meltdown. The idea that this spectacle would be shared, mocked, consumed by strangers far beyond this plane only deepened the layers of humiliation designed to suffocate Alicia. Yet Alicia sat motionless, her expression neutral, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted slightly as if daring the world to look and see the truth behind the cheap performance Veronica had staged. Veronica, emboldened by the reaction, leaned down slightly, thrusting the notebook back toward Alicia with a smirk. "Maybe you'll find a nice coloring book waiting for you in economy," she said with mock sympathy. Greg Sanders, standing by the galley door, laughed out loud, adding, "She can teach the kids down there how to draw their dreams too." His words were met with another round of mean-spirited chuckles from the cluster of passengers within earshot. The flight attendants made no move to intervene. The captain, if aware of what was happening, remained silent behind the reinforced door of the cockpit. There was no ally among the staff, no shield against the slow, methodical stripping away of Alicia's humanity piece by piece, smile by smile, chuckle by chuckle. The notebook now rested once more in Alicia's lap, her hand moving slowly to close it with deliberate finality, as a sealing not just her formulas, but also the memories of every cruel face turned against her. She tucked it carefully beneath her arm and stared ahead, her gaze fixed not on the perpetrators but beyond them, to a horizon they could neither see nor comprehend. In that moment, Alicia made no speech, no impassioned plea for dignity. Her silence spoke louder than any protest could. She let the hatred and ignorance swirl around her unchecked, because she understood something these people never would. Their laughter was not a weapon against her. It was a confession of their own smallness. Veronica Hart stood near the galley with her arms crossed, her mouth tight with irritation masked as professionalism, while Greg Sanders whispered something inaudible to another attendant, both occasionally flicking glances toward Alicia as if she were a stain they could not scrub away. Alicia remained silent, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a visible crack in her armor, but as the minutes ticked on, the tension in the air sharpened to a fine edge. Thomas Whitaker, the senior pilot for Flight 718, stepped out of the cockpit at that moment, his tall frame cutting an imposing figure in his starched uniform, his expression carved from years of unquestioned authority. His presence caused a ripple through the first-class cabin, passengers straightening in their seats, pretending to busy themselves with screens and magazines, but secretly attentive to the unfolding drama. Veronica approached him immediately, speaking in low, urgent tones, her eyes darting briefly toward Alicia as she explained the supposed disruption. Thomas listened, his jaw tightening, then nodded curtly and marched down the narrow aisle toward Alicia, his boots striking the floor with the purposeful cadence of someone delivering final judgment. Alicia looked up at him calmly, sensing the shift in atmosphere before he even spoke. His voice was firm, clipped, designed to broker no negotiation as he said, "Ma'am, I have been informed there has been an issue with your conduct. If you continue to disrupt the service flow, I will have no choice but to involve security." The absurdity of his words hung in the air, almost laughable if not for the gravity they carried. Alicia had spoken no louder than necessary, had not raised her voice, had not resisted any instruction despite the blatant discrimination she faced. Her only crime, it seemed, was refusing to disappear quietly. Alicia met the captain's gaze evenly and replied, "I have simply requested to sit in the seat I purchased. That is not disruption. That is my right as a paying passenger." Thomas's mouth twitched as if suppressing a grimace. "Nonetheless," he said, his voice growing harder, "if you do not comply with the directions of my crew, you will be removed from this flight at the next opportunity." The words hit like a slap, each syllable a fresh layer of injustice piled atop the others. Passengers pretended not to watch, but their stolen glances betrayed them. Some nodded imperceptibly in support of the crew, others shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing, deep down, that what they were witnessing was wrong, but unwilling to jeopardize their own comfort by acknowledging it. Preston Moore, sitting in row 3, snickered quietly and muttered to his neighbor, should have known trouble would follow her on board. Alicia felt the weight of every eye on her, the judgment, the assumption of guilt baked into their very expectations. She knew how the system worked. She knew that once an authority figure like Thomas framed her as a disruption, any protest on her part would only confirm their bias. Still, she refused to be cowed. I have caused no disturbance, Alicia said slowly, clearly, her voice resonant enough to reach the passengers around her without seeming confrontational. I am being targeted for insisting on my rights. That is the truth. Thomas's face hardened further. Consider this your final warning, he said coldly. Failure to comply will result in removal at the next stop. I trust that will not be necessary. Without waiting for a reply, he turned sharply on his heel and stalked back toward the cockpit. His decision made, his mind closed. Veronica smirked triumphantly and exchanged a quick nod with Greg, while Alicia inhaled deeply, grounding herself once more. She was being railroaded by the very people entrusted to ensure her safety and dignity, but she refused to let them see fear. The engines roared louder now as the plane began its slow taxi toward the runway. Alicia felt the vibrations travel up her spine, each rumble a reminder that her battle had moved beyond simple confrontation. It was now a war of endurance, a test of how long she could remain unbroken while those around her conspired to tear her down. In the seat behind Alicia, a young man who had watched the entire interaction with mounting unease pulled out his phone and began typing a message, documenting what he had witnessed. Small acts of resistance, seeds planted quietly, even if Alicia did not yet know it. Across the aisle, Veronica Hart continued to monitor her with a calculating gaze, while Greg Sanders made a show of attending to other passengers, but kept his peripheral attention fixed sharply on Alicia, ready to pounce at the slightest perceived provocation. The minutes dragged on, taut and brittle, and Alicia knew instinctively that the next move would not be in her favor. From the back of the first-class cabin, Grace Holloway, one of the youngest members of the flight crew, moved hesitantly through her duties. Grace had watched everything unfold with growing discomfort, her stomach knotting tighter, with each petty cruelty disguised as procedure. Unlike her senior colleagues, she saw the truth clearly, and though fear kept her from speaking up openly, she could not bear the injustice silently any longer. Brushing past Alicia's seat under the guise of refilling a passenger's water glass, Grace subtly let a folded napkin slip from her hand, landing near Alicia's feet. Alicia noticed immediately, but waited until Grace disappeared down the aisle before reaching down with casual slowness to retrieve it. Unfolding it carefully, Alicia found a hastily scrawled message inside, the ink smudged slightly from the attendant's trembling hand. Watch your step. They want you off this flight. Stay strong. Alicia folded the napkin and slid it into her notebook without a flicker of emotion crossing her face, but inside, her heart pounded harder against her ribs. The warning confirmed what she had already suspected, yet seeing it spelled out in black and white ignited a fresh wave of anger beneath her cool exterior. She would not be driven off this plane like a criminal. She would not vanish quietly to make them comfortable. Rising slowly from her seat, Alicia moved with deliberate calm into the aisle, her notebook still clutched securely under one arm. The eyes of the cabin snapped toward her as if pulled by some invisible current, curiosity and expectation mingling with thinly veiled disdain. Alicia took a single step forward, intending to request once again, firmly but respectfully, that her seating be honored according to her paid reservation. However, before she could speak, a voice from behind spat out sharply, "There she goes again, causing problems." Preston Moore, emboldened by the growing hostility toward Alicia, stood up from his seat, his voice loud and oily as he said, "Captain already gave you a warning, lady. Maybe it's time you listen for once." His words carried like a contagion through the cabin. A woman in the second row added in a crisp tone, "This is first class, not a public debate hall." Another passenger chimed in, a man with a heavy gold watch gleaming on his wrist, "You're making everyone uncomfortable. If you can't behave, you should leave." The words piled up quickly, harsh and unrelenting, their voices weaving together into a rising chorus of disdain. Alicia faced them silently, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted, refusing to shrink under the barrage. She turned slightly to meet the collective glare of the first-class cabin, her voice steady as she said, "I am simply standing for my rights. If that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps you should examine why." Her words, though quiet, cracked through the room like a lightning bolt, momentarily stunning some into silence. But others doubled down, emboldened by herd mentality and the need to defend their distorted sense of privilege. Veronica approached from the galley with hurried steps, a frown etched deep across her face. Her voice sharp and authoritative as she addressed Alicia loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear. "Ma'am, you are disrupting the experience of our premium passengers. Please return to your assigned seating immediately or face removal at the next available stop." Greg appeared at Veronica's side, his stance rigid and accusatory, his eyes daring Alicia to resist. Alicia glanced at Grace, who stood frozen near the galley, her face pale, her hands twisting nervously at her apron. No help would come from there. Not openly. Not yet. As Alicia remained unmoving in the aisle, Preston called out again, his voice dripping with mockery. "Maybe she thinks if she causes enough trouble, they'll let her stay out of pity." Laughter rippled through the rows, some sharp, others reluctant but complicit. Each chuckle, each whispered agreement, felt like another slap, another reminder that in this space, dignity was a privilege, not a right, and one she was being actively denied. Alicia inhaled slowly, feeling the burn of every injustice weigh heavier against her ribs, but she refused to let it break her. She met Veronica's gaze directly and said, "I have caused no disruption beyond asserting my place. If that is unacceptable, then the fault lies not with me, but with your treatment of me." For a moment, silence fell heavy over the cabin, but it was short-lived. The judgmental stares pressed closer, suffocating in their intensity. Alicia realized then that no appeal to reason would change their course. They had already decided she was an intruder, an inconvenience to be removed, a disturbance to be silenced. She could feel it in the air, in the rigid set of shoulders, in the eyes that refused to meet hers for more than a second, in the way even the few who recognized the injustice kept their heads down, protecting their own comfort over her humanity. Veronica Hart stood a few feet away, arms folded across her chest, her lips pressed into a thin line of manufactured authority, while Greg Sanders loomed beside her like a silent enforcer ready to act if Alicia showed even the slightest sign of further resistance. Preston Moore reclined smugly in his seat, one hand lazily draped over the armrest, the other scrolling casually through his phone, as if Alicia's presence were nothing more than an irritating commercial break in the luxury of his afternoon. The air around her was thick with judgment, but Alicia's breathing remained steady, her heartbeat controlled, her mind clearer than it had been at any moment during this orchestrated campaign to humiliate her. In the silence that followed Veronica's latest thinly veiled threat of removal, Alicia moved with deliberate calm, reaching into the inner pocket of her jacket and drawing out her phone with a grace so precise it was almost ceremonial. Without a word to those surrounding her, without giving an inch of her dignity to the vultures circling her, she unlocked the device and scrolled quickly through her contacts until she found the number she needed. The cabin watched her in a strange, suspended stillness, curious but mocking, assuming she was making some fruitless plea for mercy that would only underline her defeat. Alicia pressed the call button and lifted the phone to her ear, her voice low, and even when the line connected, proceed with Plan B. She ended the call almost immediately, slipping the phone back into her jacket without fanfare, her every movement measured and composed. Veronica tilted her head slightly, the expression on her face a mixture of confusion and disdain, unable to interpret what Alicia had just set into motion, but still too secure in her own imagined dominance to feel any real concern. Passengers shifted restlessly, whispering among themselves, some speculating about the call, others dismissing it as a final act of desperation from someone who clearly did not know when she was beaten. "Maybe she's calling her boyfriend to cry about it," Preston said under his breath, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, eliciting a few low chuckles from those desperate to signal their alignment with the majority. Alicia heard the remark but gave no sign of acknowledgement. Instead, she calmly returned to her seat, her posture regal, her movements deliberate, reclaiming the space they had tried so desperately to deny her. She placed the notebook back on her lap and resumed writing as if nothing had happened, as if the cabin's venomous glances and whispered insults were no more significant than the hum of the engines or the occasional turbulence bump. Veronica and Greg exchanged another glance, sensing that something was out of place but unable to articulate it. Veronica moved closer and said in a falsely sweet tone, "Making personal calls during taxiing and takeoff is against airline policy. I can report that to the captain if you would like." Alicia lifted her gaze slowly, pinning Veronica in place with a look so cold and precise it silenced her mid-breath. "You are welcome to report whatever you wish," Alicia said quietly, the calm power in her voice making Veronica take an unconscious step back. At that moment, somewhere deep in the airport's operations office, an alert pinged onto a corporate executive's phone. It contained a single sentence flagged for immediate action: "Urgent breach of VIP travel protocols on Flight 718 involving principal partner Alicia Monroe." A second alert followed it less than a minute later, addressed to the CEO himself: "Escalation required. Client engaged plan B authorization. Immediate intervention mandated." Back on the plane, the cabin crew remained oblivious to the storm that was about to descend upon them. Veronica, still riding the high of public humiliation, leaned down slightly and said in a tone dripping with condescension, "Just so you're aware, once we land, you'll be escorted off the plane by airport security. Disruptive passengers are not tolerated." Greg chuckled behind her, confident they had secured the narrative, unaware that the ground beneath their feet had already begun to shift. Alicia merely offered a faint smile, a smile so small it barely curved the corners of her mouth, but carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. She tapped the notebook closed, laced her fingers over it, and turned her gaze toward the window, watching the endless sky stretch out beyond the confines of this narrow, mean little cabin. She no longer needed to fight them directly. The mechanism she had set into motion would speak for her. The first ripples of discomfort began to surface when a senior operations officer at the airline's corporate office placed a direct call to the captain's private line, bypassing all standard communication channels. The captain, who had until now seen Alicia as a minor nuisance to be managed by protocol, stiffened visibly when he answered the call, his posture straightening as the voice on the other end explained, in curt, furious tones, that a catastrophic mistake had been made and that if corrective action was not taken immediately, the consequences would be unprecedented and devastating. Alicia sat in seat 1A exactly where she belonged, her posture composed, her expression serene, the notebook resting on her lap like a silent witness to everything that had transpired. The captain paused near her seat, clearing his throat awkwardly, drawing the attention of every passenger nearby, their heads swiveling to observe the next move in the drama they thought they understood, but had only just begun to comprehend. Thomas forced a polite smile onto his face, the muscles in his jaw tight with suppressed panic, and said, "Ms. Monroe, I would like to personally apologize for any misunderstanding that may have occurred. Please, let me assure you, you are welcome here." The words dropped heavily into the charged atmosphere of the cabin, the sudden shift in tone sending ripples of confusion through the passengers. Veronica's heart froze mid-step as she moved down the aisle, her mouth opening slightly in shock. Greg Sanders stopped pretending to organize supplies at the galley and stared openly, the blood draining from his face. Preston Moore lowered his phone slowly, his smirk faltering into something closer to unease. Alicia regarded the captain with a gaze so steady it made him fidget under the weight of it, but she gave only a small nod of acknowledgement, the bare minimum of civility, offering him neither forgiveness nor further engagement. She returned her attention to the view beyond the window, dismissing him with a grace so profound it felt like a rebuke sharper than any words. The tension among the passengers morphed rapidly from smug superiority to thinly veiled anxiety, as whispered conversations sparked like brush fires through the cabin. A few glanced nervously at Alicia, as if trying to reassess her importance, to recalibrate the social hierarchy they had so eagerly weaponized against her. Meanwhile, toward the rear of first class, a young man who had been quietly observing the scene with growing horror had already been streaming the encounter on his social media account. His phone, balanced discreetly between the seat and tray table, had captured Veronica's taunts, Greg's laughter, Preston's mocking jabs, and the captain's earlier threats. His voice whispered off camera, "I don't know who she is, but this feels wrong. Someone's going to get fired over this. He did not realize how right he was. Within minutes, the live stream was picked up by a growing audience, shared rapidly across platforms. Hashtags exploding like fireworks in the digital night. Hashtag Flight 718 disgrace. Hashtag Justice for Alicia. Hashtag Flying While Black. The comment sections seethed with outrage, sympathy, disbelief. Journalists and influencers reposted the footage, tagging the airline's official accounts, demanding explanations. Inside the cabin, none of the crew yet understood how quickly the situation was spiraling out of their control. But the first tremors became visible when Thomas's radio crackled again with a terse message from corporate headquarters. Immediate damage control required. VIP status confirmed. Prepare for public statement upon landing. Passengers began refreshing their phones, murmurs swelling into open discussion, as news alerts popped up announcing that Alicia Monroe, the woman they had mocked, belittled, and tried to expel, was in fact the founder and CEO of Hyperion Research, the groundbreaking technology firm whose innovations in renewable energy storage had made international headlines. A firm currently finalizing a strategic partnership worth over $1.5 billion with the airline they were all flying on. The realization hit like a silent bomb. Preston Moore shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier arrogance evaporating into a cold sweat. He leaned toward his neighbor, whispering harshly, "Did you hear? She owns half the damn future of this company." His companion nodded mutely, their faces pale and drawn. Veronica's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the cuffs of her blazer, her mind racing to craft a plausible excuse, a way to minimize her role in the unfolding catastrophe. Greg turned away entirely, pretending to be absorbed in adjusting the coffee machine behind the galley wall. Only Alicia remained unchanged, an island of calm in the center of a gathering storm she had predicted, but allowed to brew unchecked until now. The pilot, clearing his throat again, bent slightly toward her and said, "Ms. Monroe, if there is anything we can do to make your journey more comfortable, please do not hesitate to let us know." His voice cracked slightly at the end, the false warmth unable to mask the desperation underneath. Alicia finally turned her gaze from the window and met his eyes with the faintest trace of a smile that said everything. "You should have thought of that before." As Alicia Monroe calmly flipped another page in her notebook, the crew scrambled behind the scenes to contain the damage. But it was too late. Corporate headquarters had moved faster than anyone on board could have predicted. In the airline's executive suite, high above the city skyline, the CEO of Stellar Airways stood at the head of a crisis meeting, his voice sharp and merciless as he barked into the speakerphone connected directly to Flight 718's cockpit. Effective immediately. Suspend the entire crew involved. No debate. No discussion. We will not risk further liability. The command hit Captain Thomas Whitaker like a sledgehammer, and he relayed the directive with a stiff, mechanical voice, barely able to mask the dread rising in his chest. Veronica Hart was the first to be pulled aside by a senior purser, her face blanching as she was informed that upon landing, she would be escorted directly off the aircraft, stripped of her badge and uniform pending investigation. Greg Sanders was next, the arrogant smile he had worn for most of the flight wiped clean as reality crashed down upon him. Grace Holloway, though involved only peripherally, was shaken but spared the same fate. Her earlier warning to Alicia now the thin line that saved her career. The passengers, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation thanks to the viral live stream and subsequent news alerts pinging their devices, watched the unraveling with a mixture of grim fascination and barely concealed fear. No one dared to meet Alicia's gaze anymore. Preston Moore hunched low in his seat, tapping frantically at his phone, perhaps drafting some weak apology or trying to distance himself from the public spectacle he had so gleefully fueled. Meanwhile, Hyperion Research's legal division had already sprung into action. Within 2 hours of the incident going viral, a formal press release was issued. It was short, brutal, and devastating. Effective immediately, Hyperion Research is terminating all contractual negotiations and existing agreements with Stellar Airways. We do not conduct business with organizations that fail to uphold basic standards of respect and equality. The markets reacted with savage speed. By the time Flight 718 touched down, Stellar Airways stock had begun a sharp, bloody descent. Financial news outlets flashed red banners across their screens, headlines screaming about the collapse of a major partnership and the staggering losses projected from the canceled contract. Analysts began slashing target prices, investors bailed out en masse, and competitors circled like sharks sensing blood in the water. Inside the cockpit, Captain Whitaker sat stiffly, staring at the runway lights ahead, but seeing only the ruin of a career that had once seemed untouchable. He knew the airline would need a scapegoat to appease public fury, and he would be among the first offered up in sacrifice. His earlier smug confidence that one black woman could be brushed aside without consequence now seemed laughably naive. Veronica, sitting in the galley with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, stared straight ahead, her mind replaying every petty insult she had flung at Alicia with horrifying clarity. Greg leaned against the service counter, his face buried in his hands, silently cursing his own arrogance. Even Preston Moore, though nominally just a passenger, had already received notification that his corporate board position at a Fortune 500 company was under review after the footage of his mockery went viral. When the plane taxied to the gate and the seatbelt sign flickered off, no one moved. The silence was suffocating, oppressive, a collective waiting for judgment to fall. The first people to board were not cleaning crews or ground staff, but a small team of executives in dark suits accompanied by security personnel. They moved directly to the first-class section, their expressions grim, their intentions clear. One by one, members of the crew were pulled aside. Their badges were taken, their access revoked, their names added to a growing internal blacklist that would shadow them for the rest of their careers. Thomas Whitaker tried to maintain an air of dignity as he surrendered his credentials, but could not hide the tremor in his hand. Veronica and Greg were less composed, Veronica whispering frantic protests about misunderstandings and unfair treatment, Greg muttering bitterly under his breath about social media mobs. Alicia remained seated throughout, her presence a towering monument of silent vindication amid the wreckage. She did not gloat, did not celebrate, did not even acknowledge the officials who moved around her. She had already said everything that needed saying by refusing to be broken. As she finally rose from her seat and gathered her belongings, a hush fell over the cabin, the passengers shrinking back as if mere proximity to her might call judgment upon them too. She walked down the aisle with measured grace, her steps echoing in the stunned silence, a procession of quiet triumph. At the jet bridge, a senior airline executive waited nervously, flanked by PR representatives and legal counsel. He extended a hand tentatively, offering a desperate, rehearsed apology. Alicia paused, glanced at his hand, and then turned away without a word, moving past them into the terminal, where a cluster of flashing cameras and news reporters awaited her. 5 years later, the memory of Flight 718 still lingered in public consciousness, a stark symbol of how arrogance and prejudice could dismantle lives and reputations in a matter of hours. Stellar Airways had never fully recovered from the scandal. The collapse of the Hyperion research deal had triggered a domino effect that saw the company lose major partners, suffer lawsuits from shareholders, and ultimately file for bankruptcy within 3 years. New airlines rose to replace them, but the cautionary tale of their fall was taught in business schools and diversity training seminars across the country. For those directly involved in the disaster, the years that followed were a crucible of reckoning. Veronica Hart, once the poised, ambitious face of Stellar's premier cabin service, found herself blacklisted across the entire airline industry. Every job application, every interview, ended the same way. Polite apologies, regretful rejection emails, the unspoken but undeniable judgment that she was too great a liability. At first, Veronica raged against it, blaming Alicia, blaming social media, blaming anyone but herself. But time has a way of stripping away denial. When a friend from her old life suggested she volunteer at a local human rights center as a way to rehabilitate her image, Veronica agreed reluctantly, thinking it would be temporary. She did not expect to be changed. The first few weeks were brutal. her presence barely tolerated by activists who remembered her face from viral videos and news reports. Veronica spent long hours sorting supplies, preparing meals for displaced families, and listening quietly in the back of workshops, where people shared stories of discrimination far more brutal than anything she had ever imagined. The more she listened, the more the walls she had built around her own ignorance began to crumble. She began to really see the humanity she had once dismissed with a sneer and a smirk. It was a slow, painful transformation, but it was real. One evening, after helping organize a youth outreach event, Veronica sat on the curb outside the community center, staring at the sunset bleeding into the horizon. A young activist sat down beside her and said, "You don't have to fix the past, but you can make sure you're never part of the problem again." Veronica nodded silently, understanding for the first time that redemption was not a performance. It was a lifetime of small, tireless acts. Greg Sanders, too, had been cast adrift in the aftermath. Shunned from the only profession he had ever known, he spiraled through depression and bitterness before finally accepting a custodial job at a public university. It was there, while mopping floors outside a packed lecture hall, that Greg heard a professor discussing systemic bias and the invisible ways prejudice infiltrated institutions. Intrigued despite himself, Greg began sneaking into the back of the room during his shifts, listening, learning, unlearning. Over time, Greg approached one of the speakers, a soft-spoken man named Harold, and asked awkwardly if he could volunteer for any outreach programs. Harold raised an eyebrow but agreed. Greg started small, helping set up chairs and distribute flyers. But gradually, he took on more responsibilities, eventually mentoring young men from marginalized backgrounds who were trying to navigate hostile environments. There were days when guilt crushed him, when he remembered how easily he had laughed at Alicia Monroe, how eagerly he had contributed to her humiliation. But he learned that true atonement was not about erasing the past. It was about using every step forward to build a better future for others. Even Preston Moore, the passenger whose mockery had been broadcast around the world, found himself fundamentally changed. After being forced to resign from his company's board under public pressure, Preston spent years fighting lawsuits and public scorn. At first, he retreated into bitterness, but a chance encounter at a diversity seminar, mandated by court settlement, planted a seed he could not ignore. A young woman had spoken about losing her father to systemic injustice, her voice trembling not with anger, but with grief. Something in her story cracked the armor Preston had wrapped around himself. He realized with brutal clarity that his laughter, his jokes, had been part of a system that crushed people without mercy and without acknowledgement. Haunted by that realization, Preston invested what remained of his fortune into creating scholarships for minority students pursuing careers in STEM. He did it quietly, refusing interviews, declining public credit, determined to do at least one thing in his life that was not soaked in selfishness. And somewhere beyond the headlines and viral fame, Alicia Monroe continued her work. Hyperion research flourished, revolutionizing clean energy and reshaping industries worldwide. Alicia remained a quiet, commanding presence, never seeking revenge, never trading dignity for spectacle. She knew that the greatest victory was not in tearing down her enemies, but in rising so far beyond their reach that they became irrelevant. At a gala celebrating the 10th anniversary of Hyperion's founding, a small group of volunteers from the Human Rights Center attended, their presence a quiet acknowledgement of journeys still ongoing. Veronica Hart stood among them, holding a plate of appetizers, glancing across the room at the woman whose life she had once tried to diminish. Their eyes met briefly. Alicia offered a slight nod, polite but distant, and Veronica smiled back, not expecting forgiveness, not asking for it, simply grateful to have been given the chance to become better. In the end, redemption was not a headline or a grand gesture. It was found in the quiet rebuilding of a life, with every intention set right. The end. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more powerful narratives like it, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an update. We would love to hear your thoughts. What was the most powerful moment for you during Alicia's journey? And where in the world are you watching from today? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice helps keep these important conversations alive.